Okay, well, I'm anticipating that some more may join us, but I think we will make a start. Welcome back to the fourth and final session of our conference about scandalous scholars and how we handle the legacies that they have left us. I think it's been, in my opinion, the speakers have all been exceptionally helpful and good, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation with our four main speakers. So we have Fran Porter is here. I'm hoping Daniel Drost will join us again in a minute. Carolyn Whitnall and Chris Norden as well are with us. I'm hoping this might be a relatively free-flowing discussion. As I said to the panel, I have lined up some questions to keep the conversation going. I will certainly kick off with a question. I'll certainly finish with a question. It may be that in between conversation flows freely, and I'd like to invite attendees to contribute, and I will try and keep alert to hands. But if it feels appropriate just to kind of speak up, then feel free to do that. We'll try and make it as informal as we can. Imagine that we've got the four plenary speakers sitting on a low dais, but basically the rest of us are all sitting around in a circle. So that's kind of that's what we're thinking. Good. So thanks so much for coming back, especially to the panel. And I'm going to start off with a question, which I invite you to bat around a bit. So we've been speaking mostly, the individuals we've been talking about, John Howard Yoder, Michel Foucault, and RP, who Chris was speaking about yesterday. Now, all of those committed crimes which I think would be fairly described as abusive in various measures, but not all the scholars that we might be talking about will have necessarily committed a criminal offence or done something that would be necessarily considered as abusive. I suppose a good example would be Karl Barth, who was found, relatively recently, I think it became clear that he was in a ménage à trois, which is not conduct that we would generally consider to be becoming of a Christian theologian. And although I think this would count as abusive, it wouldn't count as illegal. We might want to think about people like Martin Luther, whose anti-Semitism was really quite, his anti-Semitic rhetoric was really quite, to our ears, to contemporary ears, really scandalous. So I'd like to open it up a bit to situations beyond the, I'm not suggesting that how we handle the issues we've been talking about is cut and dried, but I think the scandalous nature of what they did is fairly cut and dried. What do we do with people like Barth and Luther, for that matter?
Go on, Carolyn.
Yeah, I guess my instinctive thought there is that my instinctive thought has just completely gone from my head in that moment. That the context in which their ideas were produced is always relevant. That's the same for any scholar. We're all situated. And I think thinking about attribution in terms of bringing context into view so that we can properly evaluate the information that we've received, the ideas that we've received. And so for me, it's really about moving towards a more collective view of knowledge. So the ideas of Barth, of Yoder, they no longer belong to Barth and Yoder. They are part of our collective knowledge. As I think it was Fran said very well yesterday, they impact regardless of what we think of their origins. And so in terms of moving forward and what we do with theology from the point where we are, it's really important to contextualize all of the information that we take in. And I think for me, I sort of wish that there was a way of decoupling attribution, contextualizing information, from endorsement or prestige, because those two things, if we were able to separate those, I think we would have a much easier time of navigating these types of questions, because attribution would be such a natural thing to do in terms of how we responsibly handle our collective knowledge resources. And then endorsement is an optional extra. There's nothing to stop you saying positive, affirming things about a scholar, recognizing the value of their lived example to the world, for for example. But those two things don't necessarily need to be tied. But I think we're so obsessed with fame and celebrity. As soon as, I mean, Chris, your talk was very aptly identifying the fact that naming someone is to big them up. It does do that. And it's just almost a shame that we can't stop it from doing that, so that we can all be a bit more honest about the resources that we're dealing with. Maybe that's, sorry, my first thought.
I think there's something about telling the stories, isn't there? I mean, I think a lot of people are probably not aware of the Karl Barth situation, or possibly even Martin Luther's anti-Semitism. And, there is something about just getting that information out there so that people can hear their insights, but also recognize that you can be someone of extraordinary insight and creativity in one area of your life, and someone who seems to have complete blind spots or flaws in other areas of your life. And I think that's a problem with our sort of cult of celebrity and heroism, in that we want our heroes to be completely heroic. We can't accept that. And as soon as they're not, then we completely, we see this in public life, don't we? Somebody can have done a good job, but as soon as something is identified about them that's questionable, then they are completely rubbished and vilified. And I think it's part of trying to get it's about our doctrine of humanity and our understanding that even those of us who are believers are all on a journey. And that's not to excuse anything that anybody does, but a kind of expectation that as humans we are going to have blind spots, and that applies to us, the viewer and the hearer, as well as these people that we're talking about. And I was really struck by what Gail was saying last night about William Knibb and Carey, and these were people who are generally regarded as having done good stuff, and certainly in Knibb's case as being amongst the better sort of white missionaries. And yet Gail really helpfully brought out the fact that he did say and do some unhelpful things, or failed to live out completely his convictions. And it's just helpful for those stories to be told. I mean, how many Baptist churches have a Carey room or a Carey hall? And some of us know a Baptist college that has a Knibb room, which is good, but unfortunately there's nothing to tell the people who go into the Knibb room anything about William Knibb and the good things he did, but also the way that he had blind spots, or a lack of courage, perhaps. I don't know enough about him to know exactly what prevented him. And to recognize that in 100 years, if the world's still going on as it is, people will look back on us and will identify behaviors that we are engaged in, which are, even by our own standards today, unethical behaviors. And I think we know some of those, our attitudes to the environment and so on. We know them, and yet we find it too inconvenient to do anything about them. So a bit like Luther with anti-Semitism, or it's not directly comparable, but I think we have blind spots that we're not completely blind to, but we're blind to their full significance. And we need someone to be able to look in on us, perhaps from another age or from another culture, and point those things out to us.
There's so much that could be said, and we could go around in circles, but I wonder if I could just bring into this something actually, Carolyn, you have raised there, and it was a big feature what you were talking about, Chris, and that is naming. Because in the case of Barth, I mean, there are so many different sides to naming. If you name someone, you big them up and so on. But others have difficulty even having their names known, or even owning their own names. I mean, I didn't get to discuss this yesterday in my presentation, that there wasn't time to think about naming and so on. But some of you might have noticed I tend to name in full names on every mention of everyone. And I included, for the purposes of this paper, that of the Mennonite scholar in question. In other papers, I have used initials. But my naming habit in that has been, it's long been my practice to name scholars in full, partly because if we do not, and we use the academic convention of surnames, then women scholars disappear, because the default theological world and theological authors are male. So we read about Painter or Porter or Whitnall, and we would think that these were men. And there may well be men with those surnames as well in the theological world. So it's just the default position, because theologians are men and you see a surname and all the rest of it. So and I follow the practice I came across actually of Daphne Hampson, who did that once in a journal article many moons ago. And she was writing about Rosemary Radford Ruther and Elizabeth Schlussler Fiorenza. So, I mean, not even short little names, three, and every mention, everyone, and it was like overwhelming on the page, and it was incredibly powerful, which of course is why she did it. I mean, I try not to sort of put names in all over the place, but at times you have to repeat a name. But so it has long been my convention, and if I'm working with colleagues, we often have a compromise where it's full name first time and surname second, second mentions and so on. That's a compromise on my part, but then it's possibly a compromise on their part to have the full names in at all. But and that partly reflects issues around of identifying and how women's work is received when it's known to be female authored, which is why so many novelists, both in decades gone by and currently, go by initials or obscure the fact that they are female in order to have better reception. There are all sorts of other issues around women and their names and whose names do we have in a culture where women lose their names, when they get married and things like that. And following the from being your father's possession to being your husband's possession and so on. So naming is actually quite complicated. But in the case of Bart, I think it's quite important, the story, because some of his work maybe wasn't all his work. This is the big question of whether Charlotte Van Braun was more than a note taker or exactly, we probably will never know, but I think the suggestion seems to be that she was instrumental, either as a really key research assistant or even more. I mean, we don't quite know. Certainly she put a lot of intellectual and other labor into the production of his work. And I'm not aware that she appears in the title anywhere, and so on. So I think in that case, this is the naming where actually this situation says something about the historiography that isn't perhaps uppermost. I mean, Rachel Mears has written an article on this, which I think highlights this. She's interested at it from this point of view, about the work, who produced this work and who has acknowledged this work and who. So stories are important from that point of view in just understanding and appreciating the work that went in. And I mean, there are horror stories from all sorts of disciplines in academia, maybe more science field than our fields. I don't know, of students and assistants who put a lot of work in but get very little credit, or whose professor always insists on having their name first, even though the bulk of the work is done. I mean, I don't know how common that is now, but it's certainly happened in the past. So naming is, you're right, it bigs people up. But on the other hand, it kind of says it's an acknowledgement as well, where an acknowledgement is due. So I think certainly in the Bart one, I think it's very important. And also, in the same way as the Wesleys, who was responsible for the sermons and the preaching and the thinking, and there's a lot more going on there. How women's labor and women's contribution can be lost if we don't name. So that just confuses things even more, because that's kind of a different approach to the not naming of either because we do not know names, or we do not want to give profile to names.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit more? Because one of the differences between your presentation, Fran, and yours, Chris, was that you chose to name for the reason that you identified, and Chris, you chose not to name for the reason you identified. And I was wondering what you thought of each other's decision. Chris, I was particularly interested in whether, I don't know which way who to ask, but I suppose the question of so Fran's challenge that if the name isn't associated with the story, then when people find the work of, in this case, Yoda, then they won't know that this is problematic. Did you have any further thoughts about that? Risk of putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the disadvantages. I do think Yoda and my scholar are different in the sense that Yoda dominates his field to a greater degree, and often you're writing about Yoda or about Yoda's views in a much more prominent way, and therefore masking who he is becomes much more problematic, really, and just in terms of the thing making any kind of sense. So I can understand why, in a way, it's better to name him and just get that out there, and then to be able to critique him. In my case, I don't think RP, he is a significant scholar in Acts studies, but you wouldn't normally be writing at length about his views. Well, perhaps you would if you were doing a particular study on the genre of Acts or something. But it's certainly in my case, he's just another person who's written a commentary with some slightly quirky views, who it's quite helpful to be able to reference. But he's not a big player, and therefore it seemed to me, therefore it's quite nice, to make him less as unprominent as possible. But if anyone really wants to know who he is, you can find it in the bibliography, and you're going to be told up front that there is a problematic scholar here. But I agree that if you were somebody who didn't know about RP's crimes, you could read, what I'm writing and still be none the wiser if you weren't inquisitive enough. So I accept it's not. I don't think there is a perfect answer. That's the problem. I think I've come up with something that's a bit of a compromise and sort of suits my situation, but I can see that in another situation you might reach a different conclusion.
But you did tell us, Chris, that he's in the bibliography, because you can't not, if you're citing a source, you're not going to get away with that in academia. And so it actually, you've not obscured it. It's there, and it's actually quite easy for anybody who has access to a paper. If you publish it, they can find it, and it's really quite straightforward for them to find it. And if they don't know who it is, they'll be very curious to find out, and they'll go looking. So and the clue is there in your RP. So I don't think it's about you pretending that we're not going to know who this is. I think I would say you're doing something different. You're not, you're actually letting people know who it is. So you're spreading the word in that sense, but you and with sufficient information about what we're talking about, so that people know why you're doing this, in a brief description of what had happened. And so to me, it's more about communicating, for all the reasons that you said, respect to the victims, just general public culture that you're trying to create. So, and in that sense, I'm not necessarily doing something too different. I mean, in previous, the very first piece I had published about this, I went for initials, and with an explanation of why. But I work in education, and every round, working with doctoral students, and we get applications every year, and year after year, somebody's application, good application, will have a quote from Yoda. And and it usually turns out, or have him referenced somehow, either key or as a sort of other person to consult, but often, as a key contributor. And then when we have a conversation, just find out, I don't think I've come across anybody who actually knows, who's done that, who actually knows, which doesn't mean to say that somebody wouldn't know and do that, but this is what I'm finding. I was in class just 2 weeks ago. A student was presenting, and they mentioned Jean Vanier as one of his contributions to something. And so what do you do? We're in a class, we're online, and all the rest of it. Fortunately, I had met all of these students in person at one time. So what I tend to do there is just ask the question, are you aware of issues surrounding? You've quoted this person as a possible source in your work. Are you aware? And they kind of go, no, I'm not aware. So I give an indication, and first they'd heard of it. And all I do in that instance is, so you might want to think, you need to be aware, because the academic community that you will mix with will be aware if you use this source, and you need to think about it from your own point of view. And they came back with something about naming somebody else and said, oh, like so and so. And I said, well, we're talking about different but the same. Oh, so they then get what we're talking about, and we left it at that. Because I didn't want to derail the class at that stage. It was just one source among many, but nor did I choose to let it go. And I think possibly this was moving the conversation on a little bit, but I think that's why I take the opportunity. My first article, I think, did have his JHY, the full name in the title. Subsequently, he's been a fairly key piece in something I've written, and it's not there, but it's in a key word. It's not in the abstract, I don't think. I can't remember, but it's certainly a keyword. So, it's title, keyword, and abstract are what search engines use and what people go for. So if I was doing something, and in my paper yesterday, I didn't have his name in the title, even though it was all about him. So that was kind of compromise there. I didn't want to put in the title, but if I was publishing something like that, there would be a keyword, or it would be in the abstract, purely so that it is searchable and it appears. And that's not a perfect option, but it's just because with this particular scholar, and with his worldwide reach and some of the students that I come across, they just do not know. And I think we overestimate how people outside of America and Mennonite circles, and outside the USA, how far this knowledge has gone. I mean, I don't know, maybe it had, but I'm still Central Asia, Middle East, Hong Kong, these places, and it hasn't reached there. So anyway, enough from me.
Thank you. I've got a question from Brandon, and then I see your hand after that, Erica, so we'll come to you after that.
Yeah, thanks so much for these thoughts. Just kind of following up, Fran, on the kind of very practical nature of these questions, especially within a classroom. This question is for everyone, not just for Fran, but just following what Fran said. Thinking about, my discipline of Hebrew Bible, basically wherever you go, there's just bad guys. There's Nazis, there's people who are just terrible anti-Semites, or anti-Judaism, you name it, they're out there. And I remember distinctly within a class trying to explain the Deuteronomistic history and how the guy who came up with it fought in the war, but it's really kind of murky and complicated. However, they should be aware of it, that he probably was a Nazi, but we don't quite know all the details. And some student was just very honest and was like, okay, well, if he's a Nazi, then why are we studying this? And you're like, that's a good question. I don't have an answer. You have to know this. You can't do graduate work on Hebrew Bible and not know this topic. That would be foolish. And so in one sense, within this applies to, I think, every discipline, not just Hebrew Bible, but within kind of further academic studies of the Bible or theology or history, what have you, philosophy, we heard earlier today. there's going to be really crucial topics that you need to talk about because that's the discipline. And until we completely decolonize disciplines, you're going to have to talk about certain topics. And so one part of this question is, well, how do you do that in a pedagogically informed way, or in a way that's not going to be every lesson is just like, by the way, these people are terrible, because that will, you only have, a short amount of time, and you can't give you can't clear your throat for half the class explaining everything. So even though you might want to, right? So how do you do that for these really crucial topics? And maybe following up on that is, you actually, no, I'll have another question later if we have time. But in that case, how do you talk about really important topics, contextualize it, but do so in a way that is actually going to help students or help your audience, and not simply be like, I don't think we're doing this intentionally, but without it becoming a kind of virtue signaling, talking to people who aren't actually in the room.
I think, I mean, I'd be very interested to know actually how people on the screen, in whatever context you work, do this. I mean, you've indicated, Brandon, there how it might come up. I mean, I think there are different ways. I mean, I think at IBTS, one of the things that we did was one of our research gatherings, which are week-long events. We had a seminar session specifically to look at this one particular scholar as a way of making everybody aware and acknowledging that this is something that affects us in particular. I mean, it's an interesting question. That was a year and a half ago. Student body numbers change. There'll be new people coming in. Do we repeat this? But that was kind of a one curtailed. I think if I was doing a piece theology, then I think I would make it an integral part of the course somehow, so that it is dealt with consciously. It may well come up again and again and again if it's a constant objection, or if it's from students. But I know what you mean, because it can derail. An innocent question or a comment can derail, especially if this is new. And you get these different, often visceral responses actually in a classroom. But I think if for something that you're describing, if that is a scenario, then I think in a course, then a good, whatever class or half a class would need to be just looking at it and saying, be aware. I mean, one of the ways, or the way I have always tried to approach it with the students I come across is, it's about preparing them to engage, so you don't end up like Chris going and talking about this scholar, using his name, using his work, and being taken by complete surprise when somebody says, what about? And that might have been done nicely, Chris, or it can be done quite aggressively, which is a very confusing experience, because you don't know what's going on and what's happening. So one of the things that I feel as an educator is my responsibility is to let students know that this is something that they may well be held accountable if they use this in their work, and to be prepared to defend whatever choice they make, which could be to leave out. They might have to defend the leaving out as much as defend the putting in, if that's the way they go. Or if somebody says, why didn't you use? Or you used, why have you, so I mean, in that sense, it's a very pragmatic thing. I think students need to know. I also think, though, if this isn't a little bit too esoteric, but I mean, I think theological education is about personal growth and personal development. I think often theological education, certainly at advanced level, is very much about spiritual development as well, or it can be. And I think it's part of good ethical research practice to know about these things if in your particular area, whatever that may be, to give yourself a chance to work out what you think or live with the ambiguities or whatever. So I'm beginning to think we don't have a choice as educators, but to somehow broach this. But I do agree with you. You don't. There are other things students need to know about as well, and so on. Yeah, and I have some other thoughts, but anyway, that's plenty from me.
Yeah, not much to add other than, I mean, I'm new to theological teaching, but it seems to me that, you know, something not necessarily extensive, but early in people's theological education that says, you know, we don't do plagiarism. But there are some other ethical issues which are more, in some ways, more complicated around the authors we cite. And you will, over time, come to discover that some authors seem to be more ethically suspect than others. And you'll have to, as you've said, work out your ways of dealing with that. I think those of us involved in biblical studies also have the gift of all these characters in our primary text who are just great examples to draw on. I mean, I used Paul, but there's, you know, those of you who have Old Testament, you have a much richer stream of sort of material, don't you? I mean, and John's put some of them in the comments. You know, Moses and David. You know, you can use these as, you know, these are people who have been named. In some cases, they even seem to have been named for stuff that they probably didn't write anyway. And how does the Bible deal with them? And I suppose that's what I was trying to do a little bit with Paul. But you know, it could become part of the way you teach the biblical narratives, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, I would say I don't think there's any foolproof way of doing this that guarantees we won't get it wrong. I mean, I think the biblical characters absolutely, and yet because God used them, people seem to overlook that. I'm not suggesting that's what happens in biblical studies class at theological level, but on a popular level, that's always been the rationalization. And unfortunately, I've seen that with Yoda. I've seen that. You know, God knew about his feet of clay, presumably, said one commentator. So who are we not to receive the gifts God has given us through him? So that's very much like we treat Moses and David and all the rest on a popular level. So even taking that as a you know, you can do anything. You can make the Bible, Christian theology, God, do anything you want it to if you really, you know, I don't know about Caroline, the pride, the Van Hoosen said, you know, but the human heart is deceitful above all things and all the rest of it. We can deceive ourselves, so we're all capable of so anything that seems like, oh well, this is a nice sound biblical route or whatever, can be taken and used and twisted. So we always have to beware, I think. You know, God used Yoda, so what's the fuss? Great things have come. And
what this is suggesting to me is that we need a better theological grounding in the whole task as like a meta pedagogical task. I would like to see students come into theology and biblical studies with a general recognition that theological ideas all have a historical context of production, and to operate on that basis, to recognize that we too are situated and that the work we're doing is contextual and sin tainted and contingent. And then I think if we frame the learning task in that way, I would like to think that maybe it becomes easier to give these kind of shorthand warnings that Brandon is, you know, we can't unpack every single one, but if you've got a framework of thought that recognizes that this is happening, then maybe it becomes easier to signal, you know, where the problems are briefly, and then allow people to take that information into responsible account in their wider learning, maybe. But as like a sort of pre-task, a sort of the first class being, this is what theology and biblical studies is. It's all inside human sin and finitude in some way.
I think I see John's got his hand up, but I think the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, not even in sort of postgraduate theological study, but in sort of seminary training about the human frailty, and because we do know some abuses have come from people who are pastors more than theologians, in the sense of academic careers and so on, and terrible abuses of power, and that should also be inculcated somehow in a ministerial training route, I think, in a similar fashion. But I think that's very helpful, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to mention for those who weren't involved in it, so this is the second conference in a project that the CSBV is running this year called Toxic Legacies. So about a month ago, we held a conference called Preying on the Sheep, it was a pastoral leaders conference, really. It was about church cultures of abuse and their aftermaths. And it was excellent conference, in my opinion, and the videos from that are available. So I'll just mention that in the back of what you just said, Fran, because I think that's really important and helpful. I'm going to come to Erica now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been thinking on this and talking about this topic, and so when it came up, I was really very interested, intrigued, and I have more questions than answers, which is a great sign of a scholarly conference. So I think I have so many questions, so I'm going to try to like kind of narrow in. First of all, I'm coming not from theology primarily, but from biblical studies and specifically ancient Near Eastern languages. So the figures that have been brought up and talked about in this session, or in this past 2 days, are not typically ones that I've already known about, which has been interesting. More like things that I've had conversations, the people that I've had conversations about are more like Jan Eustens recently, and Kittel, who helped create Biblica Hebraica Trigarcentia. And we can't just throw that out. You know, that's an actual practical work. And, you know, even going back to years ago when I started my PhD, I told my now Dr. Barter, I would not bring in St. Augustine. I didn't want to deal with him because he was involved in a sex cult. And I don't care what you do. If you're doing things that are abusive or harmful and you're writing on biblical studies or theology or anything, it seeps into it. I watch a lot of sci-fi and read a lot of sci-fi. And guess what? Sci-fi appears all over in my writing and in my teaching all the time. Making connections and just implicitly and explicitly. So anyway, all of that to say, I think some of this boils down to how that there might be a different discussion, I think, for someone living today that has been caught in criminal behavior or immoral behavior, and someone who is dead and before, because it's the easy, I feel like the easy consensus that we've been coming to is we need to contextualize the scholarship in its place, right? I can't avoid dealing with Augustine's teachings or writings, but I can contextualize it as best that I can. And I can also go and say, even though Augustine was the voice that was popularized, he's the loudest voice that was kept from that time period, I can go back and find rabbinical writings and other things from that era, other writings and theologians and contemporaries, and maybe draw out some voices that were long forgotten because they were silenced. So I think that's important for people for scholarship about those who are dead, because we're going to move beyond that as time goes by. But for people who are alive today, how do we, you know, is there a path to forgiveness in cancel culture? Is there a path to reconciliation? And I'm going to use an example, not from biblical studies, because I don't know of any that are alive right now off the top of my head, but I'm just going to talk about how The Sandman is such a great show, and Neil Gaiman was recently canceled, and so that means I get no more Sandman like shows. So like, is there a way that we can like make a way that people can pay penance? I guess it's hard in Western culture because we traded off an honor shame culture for a culture of hierarchy and capitalism in many ways. So I don't know if anyone can address some of that. I think it would, I know it doesn't directly have to do with teaching in a classroom, but for those of us who are writing and doing research, how much do we go down that, how much do we go down that path of researching the character of people that we're reading and studying and writing about? So just pose that out for y'all. I mean, to be very specific, does like in the case of Yoder and Houston, does engaging in pornography in your free time influence your brain and your mind in any way that's implicitly impacting the way that you write about or teach theology? Or is there just no connection between the things that we do in our hobbies or on our free time?
While this may sound like I am avoiding the question, because I am, or not answering it in a direct way, I mean, I do think there is a reason to understand why perpetrators of whatever do what they do. Partly because that's one of the ways that leads to them being stopped if caught early enough. I mean, it's actually in an abuser's best interest themselves if they're stopped sooner. But that's a kind of another story, and that needs to be somebody's concern. But I think in terms of and sorry, that's a vast generalization, but for some abusers get better and more skilled the more they get to do and get away with it, and you do this for years and years and you become very skilled, whereas you can kind of curtail some of that if you have earlier intervention, is part of what I mean. And it is some people's role, I think, to get in the minds of people and understand those kind of things, and I think it's important. I think in terms of what, certainly in terms of sexual abuse of women, men, children, I am less interested in that side of things. It's outside of my expertise, my purview, or anything, than I am at the social conditions and culture that is perpetuated and that allows these kinds of offences to go on. And I say allows because there is a sense in which little things get overlooked and become bigger things, and warning signs get missed. And certainly in the case of the Mennonite theologian, there were plenty of people who raised alarms and made objections, and nothing was done. So it's that culture that I'm interested in seeing. So my question, I think, Erica, would be, in whatever the scenario is and how we deal with their not did it impact their work, although I think is it in their work is an important question, but in terms of how I respond, is what will my response say into the public culture around this issue? That's one of the, what social impact does, how it has. So yes, I am interested in whether these behaviors impact their work, and we've already looked at examples of Yoda where it is enmeshed in it, and it certainly was in Jean Vanier. I mean, my goodness. So there's no doubt about that. And Thomas Philippe's work. So I mean that, I don't know. I've not gone into the scenarios that you're dealing with. But the other thing that I'm interested in is, irrespective of that, how we respond. What does how we respond to this fact of this abusive scholar communicate and contribute to church and wider society in confronting and dealing and stopping abuses? That's a key question for me, which I know is not everybody's question.
Sorry, Fran, can I just follow up real quick? Do you mean, I do appreciate that question as I primarily work in biblical ethics, and my work, like what kind of communities we want to form and how do we get there? And then also what is our public response? But is that something that can be done by individuals, or are you talking more like institutional responses, like SBL's formal responses to things like this?
Well, I mean, I think institutional responses are very important. So I mean, I think it's both. I mean, I think, for example, having Rachel Waltner-Guzen's account from the Mennonites, having Larsha's commissioned report, you know, these are actually very useful and ways that the relevant institutions have taken some responsibility as well. But I think, and we can only do what we can do. We can't, you know, change institutions if they won't move and whatever. But if we're teachers, if we're pastors, if we're in conversations with young people, whatever it is, what is how do we respond? I mean, in very, very small ways, I now realize that if I come across in a classroom situation or in an interview situation or in a conversation, I can't just let things not be followed up. I could follow up with the individual, of course, but I really need to do something there and then, but very gently. I mean, it's a very, very small thing, but it's a position I've now suddenly realized that this is, I can't just, oh, well, we'll follow that up if it comes up again, you know. So that's one small thing that I do as an individual. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on if that's okay, because I'm aware that there's other hands up. I think, John, you're next.
Yeah, just continuing on that point of, you know, what can we do to make this less likely to happen again or become less frequent? And I think linking to a point Carolyn made earlier, and also in the panel earlier, I think about the kind of wider structural context that's making this happen and the absolute need to prioritize decentering. So one of the things we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again is implicate the ideas of a figure like John Howard Yoder in his own sexual abuse and name that. But I think more, well, not more, but alongside that, it's absolutely essential to get away from this heroicization, this kind of great men, and it is usually great men approach to teaching anything. You know, in Christian doctrine studies, which is probably what I know best in this area, my main area is in political theory and international relations, but in this area, you know, it's standardly taught by just a series of men being taught for their ideas, and then you might tag a woman or a brown person on the end. And I don't think that improves matters, because the fundamental problem is heroicizing these individuals and their ideas. Now, there's some value, of course, in situating ideas within an individual in their context, but surely the bigger mission of education in that area should be to teach how we come to know God better, if it's a doctrine of God we're talking about. And so I just feel like the need to kind of highlight cases and demonstrate where perpetrators have done things and actually tackle the kind of some of the impunity around that also requires us to move away from this centering on individuals and their ideas. You know, there aren't really great thinkers. After all, they're only flawed thinkers. I just, yeah, I hold that quite passionately, so I wanted to contribute that.
Thank you. Anyone want to come back on that, or should we take that as a comment?
No, only to add that I was asked some questions yesterday about repentance. Would repentance change our view on this? And I've been sort of mulling that over that since, and I haven't really come to a strong conclusion other than the observation that the kind of people that we've been talking about on the whole seem to find it very difficult to repent. And I'm not an expert on this field, so maybe there are some counterexamples, but I think most of the people we've been talking about seem to, well, in some cases they've gone to their death, with their crimes undiscovered, and didn't repent before. But in other cases they have been confronted with their crimes, and because of their power and their personalities, perhaps, because they were alpha males, they seem to find it particularly difficult to eat humble pie, to say, yes, you know what, I've really messed up, I seek forgiveness, I'll act in accordance with that. And that's obviously troubling, but but on the other hand, if somebody did repent, I think I would be quite, again, this is down to my personality. I'm very much a there but for the grace of God go I sort of person. I can imagine myself in situations where I would fall into temptation, but because of my upbringing or education or opportunities, I haven't. So I suppose I'm naturally inclined to be sympathetic to people who get themselves in a mess if they're prepared to recognize that and try and make amends in some kind of way. But on the other hand, you have to think of their victims and all the people that they've harmed in the meantime. So I haven't yet discovered the answer to that question, but I do think repentance is something that we need to reflect on a bit more.
Both, I wanted to say a big amen to John's thing about de-heroicizing everybody, but also kind of, and partly related to that, reflecting on Chris's kind of thoughts about repentance, I feel quite strongly that we need to decouple repentance from any questions of platform and power. The removal of platform and power is not a punishment. It's a recognition of somebody's failure to live up to the responsibility of holding that power. So once they have shown themselves to be irresponsible holders of power, irresponsible spokespeople, to have allowed, whatever sin and taint in their life to potentially corrupt their thoughts and epistemologically compromise what they're doing. The questions are not then, do we forgive them? Have they repented? Have they changed? That's a separate thing, which is important for us as Christians, because that's to do with someone's status in the community and kind of humanity. But it's not connected to the question of, do we then restore their influence, which is one about whether they're bringing information that is useful for answering the types of questions that concern us in the world, which is a separate thing in my mind. Sorry.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Simon, let me come to you.
Thank you. I mean, my knowledge is a little bit around Karl Barth. I would have thought in repentance, probably for him, there was no repentance, considering Charlotte von Kirschbaum is buried in the same tomb in the family slot in Basel. But my question really is around, if we reject some of the work perhaps of Barth around his ethics or his writings on discipleship, how do we treat those who are his peers, who actually saw what was happening and have failed to take part, or perhaps those like Moltmann or Jungel and Bush, who have been his students and then carried on some of his work in a different way? Do we need to give a warning, or should we ignore them?
I suppose one answer would be to say that this is what Caroline, I think, was talking about in terms of, wasn't it Caroline, situating, or was it John? Oh dear. And you're jumping around on my screen as well. But it was the conversation that others have already said about raising this as the context in which we do theological study and what theological study is. I'm a little wary about trying to get into somebody else's head to know what their motivations were or why they acted in the way they did. I'm not saying that there aren't those who can do that. We know there was somebody who did do that with John Howard Yoder. And he was absolutely furious with what happened when a professional psychiatrist made a report on him, and so much so that Yoda got the report destroyed. We don't know whether there's a copy left, but there's only kind of hearsay what was in it. So there are people who would be in, perhaps certainly among contemporaries, if not those long dead. But I'm a little wary, so I don't know what was going on with students, but they were schooled in the same kind of hero kind of discipleship, mentoring, you know, so the system is partly, I think, part of the problem there. I mean, I'm, because I come at this, as I've made plain, from with a particular, having had a particular focus, and actually not only on Yoda but on other instances of sexual abuse, the way the kind of my interest has kind of naturally stepped, as opposed to some of these other issues. It is a bit of a one track for me in that sense, which is not so helpful to everybody else, and I recognize that. But I'm not sure there is a one size fits all, Simon, in the sense that you know, what works for this might work for something else. I think one of the things that we have to do, as in so many things in life, I think, is live in a tension between valid things that are pulling in slightly different directions. It's like on the naming. Which way do we go with naming? There isn't a one fits all. And it's all very well for me to say that I'm interested in the social context and what public statements we're making by our approach to these scholars. That doesn't really help in answering the kind of questions that you raise. So that's only part of the picture. But I do like what I heard so far, that the idea that we frame all of our scholarship in this more questioning field of what we're all endeavoring to do as theologians, as biblical scholars, as pastors, whatever. And probably, John, speak directly and name the hero. I mean, Daniel mentioned it as well, didn't he? We kind of implicitly know, I think, that that's the way theology has worked, as other fields no doubt do, but theology in particular. But we probably don't name it as such. You know, there are the proper theologians who study the proper theologians, and they're the rest of us who do the marginal things, you know, so that probably needs to be named a bit more, while always trying to be respectful, I think, of other people's choices, and in the sense of the theologians that they really enjoy studying, or the theological ideas that they enjoy studying that others of us really wouldn't. So thank you, Ashley, for saying that, you know, Christian ethics is not your cup of tea, you know, because everybody has things that are not their cup of tea.
Yeah, so at the risk of, for 2 times in 2 days, being the 3 easy steps person, this, like, how do we weight things? You know, how do we gauge? I guess I'm thinking in particular towards kind of the policy writing that I did with, you know, no root to it, or very poor root to it. How do we gauge the depth of the evil, or its intersection and impact on the scholar's work? What do we do about things like burden of proof? How does burden of proof change things? Do we avoid people, you know, Brandon brought up Martin Note, you know, yes, a German soldier in World War II, but as far as I'm aware, Brandon might correct me, it's not clear that he was a Nazi. And those are very different categories. Do we avoid people because they might have been involved in some of the worst wrongs we can imagine? Yeah, how do we think these things through well?
I think suggest, just for myself, we deal with what is in front of us. We can't necessarily deal with everything. We deal with what is in front of us.
So you'd counsel against, sorry, you'd counsel against a kind of overall policy before situations arise.
That's a good question. Is policy what? I have my own sort of personal policy. I'm not sure I have a policy that I can impose on others. What is the role of an institution? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't hear the question in that, but I see what you're saying. I mean, I think the idea that, as I think it was Chris who said, you know, we talk about plagiarism. Let's talk about this, and at least just put it on the agenda that this might be something that you consider with the scholars you engage with. And I think that's not a bad thing if that's the way the Theological Academy is going, that it's mindful of this. I think that's probably a good thing, because I think, but it's a good question then. If people not so much of a, I mean, I think some people aren't using some people, not because they're trying to be holier than thou, but just because it's too difficult. You know, I'm not suggesting that people are you know, feeling personally tainted or something. They may feel distaste. I'm not saying they don't, but it's just, I mean, how do you deal with this? It's tough stuff, and it's tough in a classroom situation. I'm not sure that's doing us favors avoiding it. So I like the idea of alerting that this is the climate in which we do theological work. This is it now. Because all these revelations, all these things that we've been discovering, this is part of it. What would that look like in a policy? That's a good question. What do we have as policy and what do we have as academic practice? I think as academic practice, I would certainly like to see it. And we all have our own power sources if we're on journal editorial boards, if we are marking student essays, if we are examining, if we are teaching, we have our own ways of exerting our thoughts. I'm not saying that's good, and therefore I'm saying therefore that is how this will play out, unless I suppose we have an agreed practice.
And in fact, you've reminded me of another variable that was rolling around in my mind a couple of days ago, that of audience. How does, whether this is academic work or work in academic training or work for public consumption, change things? That's not necessarily a question I'm wanting you, you're welcome to take it up, but just that at least as I've thought this through, kind of both in our kind of, for my own purposes, kind of as a scholar and through this conference, there are just a lot of moving parts, and seem to be more moving parts the more I listen to you talk. You all talk.
I wonder if there's some relevance to the category of gratuitousness. I'm just, this really off the top of my head, so bear with me. Just thinking about things like in the arts, you know, there's that people like to make if you're submitting to a poetry journal, for example, they'll say we don't want any of this language used gratuitously, but if you're doing something with it, there's this sense that if you're doing something with it that is just or liberative, then there are exceptions. But it's about how you use the materials you're using, rather than drawing a hard line between particular words that you can use or particular ideas that you can use. So I wonder if, in terms of thinking about policy, I wonder if that's actually easier to answer. Fran was talking about scholarly practice. And if you're a peer reviewer, you're looking for scholarly excellence. And so I wonder if the right sorts of questions are, how are you working with the scholarly materials that you're using? Are you using great men gratuitously without critically engaging with the things that they've done, or are you doing something with it? And I think that's a kind of fairly basic scholarly question. But yeah, sorry, that's a bit on the fly.
Somebody wants to suggest, many of us would have written risk assessments where you look at gravity of risk and likelihood of risk, and then you grade risks according to how likely they are and how grave they are. And part of me wants to kind of say, do we look at the various factors that we've talked about? And kind of, I mean, I'm not suggesting we come up with a score or something, but in a sense of the way you say, well, if they've on this particular variable is very, very grave indeed, and on this variable it's less grave, and so we kind of weigh those factors in terms of, but my concern around that, apart from the fact it's a blunt instrument, is that what we're doing is exactly what we've been cautioned against, which is focusing on the abuser and not on the context in which they've caused harm. So that was me talking myself out of an answer, really. But
can I just follow up on that, Helen? Yeah, I mean, just thinking about how, you know, when it comes to a lot of these conversations, my general feeling, at least in the Zoom room here and at our previous conference, is that we're all against abuse and we all hate it and we want to see it stop happening in our world, and we're all committed to it. It just, when it comes on to these second issue kind of conversations about citation of abusers or so on and so forth, and it seems like if we hold a certain rigidity to these very important ethical beliefs and practices, if we hold a certain rigidity to them, then we will end up not citing anyone, or we will maybe not citing anyone, but we'll have to think about these issues in terms of, okay, well, you know, so if John Howard Yoder's out, is Stanley Hauerwas out because he also is obviously not an abuser, but kind of defending one? And how far down the line do we go? And I wonder if your question about the orders of magnitude and the gravity and the effects, it might be a helpful way of thinking, like, we want to see abuse stop, but if we hold a certain rigidity to these beliefs, we won't actually ever accomplish it, because we won't be talking or be engaging in these wider conversations. I don't know where we must, you know, hold the line, if you will. That's probably different for everyone, but I mean, I would love to know for other people, where that, maybe not where the line is for them, but you know, ways of thinking around how we go about engaging these scholars or not engaging them.
John, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, precisely coming in on this point, for me, I think it is fairly unambiguous in terms of a practice. And this might be provocative, I don't know, but you know, again, I would draw a little bit on what Carolyn said earlier, that it's about good scholarly practice and use of sources. And I think this maps onto some of the categories Chris was using in the presentation yesterday. So for me, some of those approaches are not valid and I would never use them. And that would include denial and abolition or cancelling. For me, the 3 steps are: you situate or contextualize, and that means you situate and contextualize a scholar amidst their violence and abuse. The second step is critique, or I think what was called revision in Chris's framework. And you must always do that. You know, that terrible acts where a student or any scholar is when you uncritically accept a set of ideas around a person, whether they're an abuser or not. And then thirdly, you reconstruct and reform the field, because the focus is on the field. It's not, unless you're kind of, I guess, in a field of studying an individual, which I wouldn't want to be. But, you know, so there are those 3 steps, which are what good scholarship is. It's always about contextualizing, critiquing, and reconstructing. And And for me, that does narrow things down. I'm not asking myself cancelling questions. I'm sorry, and I know some people are, but that's not what I'm doing. And I would apply that in my secular work and in my theological work. And to my mind, it works reasonably well, those 3 steps, in all those settings. And it takes that point I just made now, I think you made it, Helen, about, the risk of it, all that attention going back on the abuser themselves, because you're moving through those steps and away from them to what is the core issue at hand. But anyway, that's how I do it, for better or worse.
I think I was looking at time, and I've got a question I want to finish with, and I'd like to invite all our panel to answer it if they wish to, and there may be others in the room who'd like to answer it as well, because I'd love us to put our heads together on this one. And something that I think a lot about, which is the virtues of theological study, the virtues that we should cultivate as theologians, as Christian scholars and as theologians. So what are the virtues that we should cultivate in our academic work, which will help us to navigate these issues well and wisely, to serve our students well and faithfully, to handle our work with integrity, to honour God in what we do? Go.
I have dangerously many thoughts about this. I'll try and keep them short. I think realism, not idealism, as Daniel's talk brought out. Idealism, for me, is a luxury of the comfortably secure. You don't need to advocate for yourself if you've got a whole tradition behind you. And whereas, let me see, and sort of the conversation remains theoretical often. I think theological imagination and the trust in God, faith to exercise it, to imagine things otherwise than what we expect or know. An embrace of finitude and a relinquishment of mastery. And I think a collective approach to knowledge as a part of that. A contentment with sort of a messiness and a resistance to forced sense of coherence or premature closure. I'm racing through these, sorry, because I had too many thoughts. But one thing I really want to say, in view of my own talk earlier, is that I really feel that virtues can be weaponized and used as mechanisms for excluding people from the conversation. And so I would want to say that whatever virtues we aspire to for ourselves, we should resist making them into qualifications for inclusion in the wider conversation. So humility is a luxury of the comfortable. That's why I got that. Humility is easy for someone with an entire authorizing tradition behind them. They don't need to advocate. You can simply placidly repeat those things which have already been said in your interests. And I think, as well as that, the requirement of irenic discourse, which I know, Helen, is something that you hold really dear, can be essentially privileges, again, those for whom the matters in question are theoretical. So I'd want to say, yes, aspire to those virtues, but don't impose them on others, and find ways of hearing those as well without the scholarly expertise to contribute. Because there are people who can't afford to be in scholarship or who can't access it for other reasons. And if only the people inside scholarship are able to participate in the conversation, then we're going to miss so much important perspective from outside. So this has been really random and piecemeal, but that's because I was trying to do it quickly, and I should never try and do anything quickly. I should just try and make it shorter. But yeah, really like how to listen and amplify the perspectives of those outside scholarship should be part of our commitment.
Thank you. Those are really helpful ideas and some pushback on things that I keep saying, so that's all good.
I think scholarship is a verb, not a noun, in the sense that I think I would put the emphasis on the practice of scholarship rather than not rather than, because of course it's content and result, but the idea it's not a product that is finished and boxed, but it's, I suppose it's in constant need of reconstruction, which is not to mean that there's nowhere that we can stand before we do the next bit. I'm not suggesting that, but I just think there's a provisionality about all our work, which does not mean therefore it's unreliable or it's untrustworthy, or it's not fit for purpose of now, but it is always provisional, and it is always contextual. So it's not exactly a virtue, but just a way of thinking about scholarship as something we practice and we do, and we should hopefully do in community. Although I know that some people have done their scholarship excluded from the main community. So again, a virtue of doing it in community can become an exclusive thing. Anything that is good can be bad. So yeah, it's a verb as much as it is a noun, and we should underscore maybe the verb part of it.
Yes, I don't think I've got much new to add. I think I'd just like to underline, well, perhaps I'll slightly modify something that's just been said. So I completely do agree with what Fran's just said about community. I think, there's something about the scholarly world where it is about the individual's name. It's about the I and not the we. It's about wanting to attach, having I don't know if it's a human tendency or what it is, to attach ideas to specific people. And I think a thing we could inspire to would be somehow to try and encourage a moving away of that, of ideas and creativity coming from a community of people rather than from just a single person, and being concerned about what people think of me as a person. So that was my first one. And then the second one, notwithstanding what Carolyn said, because I completely agreed with her, but on the point of humility, I think this is an important one for me, but I do want to qualify that, is that this is from a personal perspective. As someone, as a privileged person, as a white male, I feel, having had relatively limited exposure to this whole issue. I've only started thinking about it in the last 2 or 3 months, and this conference has been really helpful to me, to broaden my perspective on it. But it shows me, firstly, that it's really difficult, and having some humility about what view I hold on how we approach this topic for starters, but also a humility as I look at the lives of these characters that we have referred to and sometimes avoided naming. I have to acknowledge that I can, I share a common humanity with them. I share some of the same tendencies, which were, for whatever reason, perhaps because of my privilege, I've been able to check. But nevertheless, I can see that how easy it is to fall and to get into a downward spiral and to become a monster or a scandalous person. And I don't want ever to get to a situation where my heart becomes hardened and I feel unable to recognize that what I'm doing, even in a very small way, is wrong or harmful to somebody else. So that's a sort of just something that I want to try and keep in front of my mind the whole time.
Thank you. Ashley, is your hand up from before, or is it up again?
Perhaps in some ways I'm saying what Carolyn said, but what was on my mind was humility. But I decided it wasn't quite active enough. So to go for a non-classical virtue, I think I'd like to talk about listening. Listening carefully to those we read. Again, as someone for whom Yoder was hardly a name, I think it was a bit of a gift to be able to read work on him, not wowed by him. Help me be a slightly more objective reader. Let's aim for some objectivity in our reading. And And then let's be a good listener of those around us. Because I think it's kind of come out that the evils of John Howard Yoder were actually a kind of badly kept secret. Major Christian apologist who was revealed to have been a sexual predator after his death. Some glimmers of that beforehand, especially that made some news in kind of Canadian Christian circles, because the woman involved in that act of predation was a Canadian. And are we listening carefully? Are we listening in a way that lifts others up and make sure that their voices are heard? Can we model the humility and irenic discourse that at the end of the day, I do think we need from everybody, and it'll be possible from everybody if everybody is heard, I think. Yeah, listening.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from others. I'm going to specifically ask John, because John's a very senior academic. I'm sure he's given this sort of thought.
Well, that immediately makes me feel uncomfortable in the notion of
Sorry.
It's okay, but I think it's a nice
Old.
Sure,
Been
yeah,
around a long time.
Yeah. But I mean, actually, it leads in quite nicely to my point, which is, I mean, absolutely, particularly if you're in my position, you do have to acknowledge your privilege. Chris did a little bit of that in his comments. And I thought what was great about what Ashley just said was that it was kind of a very practical approach to virtue. So he said actually non-traditional, but like listening. So it's not a virtue of love or peace, but it's a virtue of, you know, what precisely are we doing with respect to our audience, our students? So, I mean, there's an element of modeling behavior and modeling classroom conventions and dialogic and communicative conventions in the classroom, which I think comes from being open and disclosing and saying things about yourself, including your privileges, your preferences, your background. And that's why for me, although I teach in a secular university, I will talk about my faith. And many of my Christian colleagues wouldn't, but students actually appreciate that. I've never actually had oh, you're a Christian, therefore you're biased. I just have, oh, that's really interesting. And I'm not a Christian, but I'm glad you talked to us about that. I've had that quite often. And also I had, of course, Christian students come to me who appreciate that too. But I just think that sort of sense of disclosure, not holding things back, being open, that's really important. And it is kind of the other side of the listening, isn't it? It's sort of just engaging in ethics or practices of dialogue with your research or educational community, which aren't gratuitous, to use the term that Carolyn used earlier, but are kind of quite open and allow them to say, okay, I now understand a little bit about why you're teaching that or why you're saying that, because there's something about your background that I now know I didn't previously know. I think those kinds of open communicative ethics are just really important.
Okay, good. Is there anyone like to say anything final that you feel like you'd like to have said that you haven't had a chance to?
This isn't really a comment on in that regard, but I do think that this gathering over these 2 days is one of the few opportunities maybe that many of us online have had to talk about these things together. I mean, that we might have had a few occasions here and there, but it's not common. So thank you very much for organizing it.
Thank you. Well, that does bring me to thanks. I want to say an enormous gratitude to our speakers who've brought us really thoughtful, really helpful, constructive, and an element of diversity of ideas as well for us to go away and ponder want to thank those who've been with us either all for all 4 sessions or for some of those sessions. Thank you for your thoughtful questions, for being willing to keep showing up. I hope it's been of value to you. I want to thank Ashley, who has been the linchpin in terms of holding this whole thing and booking this whole thing. So enormous gratitude to Ashley for that. Brandon, who's also been very busy behind the scenes, especially with publicizing it. If you're here and you're not normally part of the CSBV, it's probably because Brandon has managed to catch your attention on social media. So much gratitude to Brandon as well. Please do, if you're not already familiar with the work of the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, as I said at the beginning, we work in the area of trying to deepen our understanding of violence within Scripture, and also looking at the areas in which Scripture intersects with a violent world, and particularly ways the Scripture is employed to do harm in a violent world. And we do in academic work like this, and publications, and we run university courses, and we do a lot of sort of church-facing outreach work as well. So if you're interested in any of that, please do probably ping me a message, and we can add you to the mailing list and try and involve you in other things that we do. So with enormous gratitude, and with perhaps finishing where we began, which is remembering those who have been harmed by the individuals that we have named, and working, as I said, in our pastoral conference that I mentioned that we had a few weeks ago, working perhaps for never again. Thank you and good night.